Hello everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on wherever you are. It's 5 a.m. in the morning in India. Uh, and I'm just very glad to welcome you all to this first panel on the paradox of crisis, interrogating emergency and crisis framing in climate infrastructures. So my name is Hema Vaishnavi, and I am a research associate with Transitions Research, a social science think tank based out of Goa in India. So I'm joined by my colleague Angelina Chamua, who heads the digital society domain in our organization, and she's here to join us as a discussant. Thank you, Angelina, for joining. So, as a research organization, our work has primarily been towards addressing the radical transformations shaping India's long-term future, particularly with regard to urbanization, climate action, and digital governance. Right. So, as an institution, we have been paying close attention to how climate justice concerns are being articulated, configured, and implemented in climate action policies. Right. So, it is precisely this concern that has led us towards questioning this discourse on climate emergency and the implications of its framings. Right. So, I am personally trained in social anthropology, and through my research, I've been looking at climate activist networks shaping up in India and South Asia, where um, calls for climate emergency have been popularized since 2019, sort of resonating with the similar calls globally, right? So, trying to understand the need for emergency declarations in a country like India, which has faced a rather bitter emergency period during the 1970s, was troubling, right? Which sort of led to this critique of the concept of emergency framing and responses, right? Um, so um, I know. So before uh, presenters for this session sort of go on or with their presentations, right? I wanted to just take a few minutes, if that's okay, to contextualize the concept before we get into individual areas of inquiry within this discourse, right? So the concept of crisis has become a pervasive lens through which we understand and respond to the challenges posed by climate change. It has seeped into policy making, and it is shaping our collective responses and influencing the very foundations of our knowledge production, right? So when we first conceptualize this panel, we aim to delve into the intricacies of emergency and crisis framings within the realm of climate infrastructure, right? So these urgent calls for declaring climate emergencies have reverberated across the globe, right, in recent years, particularly in the last couple of years, right? So reaching a climax with especially when prominent scientists, particularly from the Alliance of World Scientists, backing up this push for acceleration and subsequent translation into policy, um, dominantly, driven by this motivation, by motivation towards what they call a moral urgency, right? So claiming that this most of the planetary boundaries that regulate the earth are beyond this safe space, and these are exhortations sort of urge for climate change to be viewed as part of a larger systemic problem, right? So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to sort of cover the issues with that have already been explored with the climate emergency framing, right? Like academic literature has scrutinized the effectiveness of framing climate change as an emergency, raising the questions about its potential drawbacks and its impact on sustained governmental pressures and long-term change, right? It is in the form scientific disagreements and the potential for focus on technological solutions over socio-political changes, and also uh, the psychological impact of fear-reducing messages have been covered and have already been highlighted, right? But more importantly, the governance and policy implications of these framings have largely been unexplored, right? So recent literature has underscored how labeling climate change as a crisis leads to disbelief among public, especially if immediate dramatic impacts are not readily sort of apparent, right? This could result in a disconnect between conveyed urgency and the observable effects, potentially leading to a skepticism or sense of disengagement, right? Moreover, the overwhelming nature of the crisis might make individuals feel disempowered, possibly leading towards withdrawal from the issue due to a lack of uh, perceived lack of agency, right, in addressing such a vast and urgent challenge. Declaring an emergency is not just recognition of insecurity, it's an affirmation that urgent action is needed to protect life. This redefinition of the everyday as an emergency disrupts existing power structure and keeps sort of that hope alive for a future where conditions are transformable, right? So declarations of state of emergency interrupt that sort of linear progression of time, right? Demanding immediate action. However, even without formal pronouncements, emergency management strategies incorporate both sort of linear and this cyclical temporalities. So the collapsing distinctions between event and the sort of non-event produces an extended emergency present where perpetual sort of an instability extends and it sort of characterizes our everyday, right? Uh, and so this sort of blurring is what becomes an interesting phenomenon to explore and investigate, right? So which sort of characterizes this a permanent state of emergency, right? Uh, and which goes beyond the traditional understandings of peace and war, right? So the proponents of the emergency declarations have taken or used the analogy of the COVID-19 pandemic as an emergency, and they've equated it to the climate crisis, right? While a climate emergency serves as a call for swift action, it also sort of creates a paradox, which is sort of the essence of this panel itself, right? So this analogy to the COVID-19 response actually reveals a disconnect, right? So this sort of universal emergency measures overlook impacts on, say, socially secure and marginalized communities. The paradox, therefore, arises in the context of climate justice, right? In within this climate discourse, climate emergency goes beyond this urgency, right? It is inherently political. As we navigate this terrain, we move past characterizing um, this ecological emergency, and we because we are indeed in the midst of actively shaping uh, climate action now. We're no longer in the phase of characterizing the emergency or describing the status quo, right? So imposing top-down policies uh, implied by these emergency framings carry the risk of provoking resistance um, and may not be conducive to sort of lasting change, right? And so this sort of shift from climate risk to emergency framing marks a significant evolution in our approach to climate governance itself, right? The term emergency signifies an immediate threat demanding urgent action, a departure from the more abstract notion of future risks that existed in earlier conceptualizations, right? Yet with this shift, there are debates about the deterministic nature of emergency narratives and the setting of ambitious targets and the potential sidelining of important developmental issues, right? Um, just a second. So, dissecting the, so sorry. So dissecting this transition from climate risk to emergency framing sort of lays bare that imperative to comprehend its impact on governance and subsequently the climate infrastructures that are tacitly being assembled and created in this process, right? Therefore, it's sort of a ripe opportunity to discuss what narratives are being embedded, what uh, notions are driving these climate infrastructure, right? So before the climate emergency, dominant frame was climate risk, right? Extensive literature has shown and explored that risk across various disciplines and emphasizing the need for governance and incorporating multiple knowledges, right? However, managing climate risk has proved challenging due to complexity, uncertainty, and power dynamics, right? So the emergence of the climate emergency marked a shift from future risk to current crisis, right? Unlike risk, crisis entails urgency, threat, and immediate action, like I've mentioned uh, earlier, right? So the choice of emergency over crisis conveys an imminent danger. So analyzing the impact of climate emergency declares a climate emergency declarations reveals a complex landscape, right? While these declarations made in response to the urgency of climate change are viewed by some as very powerful tools, right, for instigating change, critics have have highlighted significant nuances. The framing of emergency often used to spur immediate action presents both opportunities and challenges. Right at the local level, where many declarations are already being enacted, there is potential for experimentation and innovation in climate action. However, these declarations' effectiveness risk being perceived as empty signifiers with diverse and sometimes conflicting meanings. Moreover, emergency approaches may inadvertently exacerbate issues of climate justice, consolidating state power, and risking regressive politics. So, the scale and temporality of the climate crisis further complicate emergency responses, right? Potentially leading to depoliticized discourses, civic inaction, and sense of hopelessness, as exemplified by the case studies that are already emerging from places like New Zealand, where studies have explored how local governments are perceiving and navigating the possibilities and also the limitations of these emergency declarations. Uh, and Practitioners, have expressed awareness of the urgency, but also skepticism of the about the depth and the meaning of these declarations, right? Political objections sort of center on fears that emergency powers can lead to authoritarian and rights infringements. Sorry. Drawing from historical examples, concerns about executive power and liberties are raised, right? For example, in Hungary, the Viktor Orban government seized the COVID-19 crisis to expand its executive power limitlessly, right? So the special medical situation gives unchecked power through decree, reflecting a wider pattern of authoritarian regimes today. Governments using extraordinary measures could create a model for handling global challenges to ecological and climate change. Uh, Comparing the idea of a global climate authority to a national level reaction, the challenge is to make the concept of a climate and ecological emergency more democratic amid authoritarian trends, right? Ensuring a fair sort of a response to these sort of planetary and global crises, right? Examining emergencies through a climate justice lens exposes these sort of stark inequalities, right? And as a research think tank based in the global south, we have been particularly interested in how the emergencies in the global north differ markedly from those in the global south, right? In post-colonial democracies, the politics of emergency unveils the inequality of climate impacts, where climate justice calls diverge from those for a climate emergency, right? So amid these sort of predominant focus on emission targets, various challenges emerge about with regard to the voices of marginalized communities facing acute impacts and influencing the global climate policy agenda for justice. Right. So yeah, I know I'm going on and on, but therefore, the sort of to tie it up, right? The debate lingers on whether emergency framing spurs fifth action or jeopardizes democratic processes. On this note, I want to introduce our first presenter, Maddie Kroot, whose research on decarbonization versus democratization in energy infrastructure conflicts will further illustrate this discourse better. Right, over to you, Maddie.
Thank you for that introduction. I will now entertain us all by struggling again with Zoom. Okay. That's step one. Come on. You'd think we'd be so good at this point. are you seeing that screen? That's annoying. Okay. Sorry. We had this.
Would you like me to share your
Sorry, I just had to navigate the screens, but it looks like you're looking at the right thing now. So one second. Great. We're seeing the right things. Perfect. All right, sorry for that delay. And thank you all for that introduction. Hi all, we have an audience of 3 in the room, so thank you all for coming. And thank you for coming to this very last session at 4S. Thank you to the organizers for arranging this session and for Kanaka Maoli for hosting us on the stolen, illegally occupied land of Hawaii. My name is Maddie and I'm a PhD candidate in geography at Clark University, currently 6 months into my doctoral dissertation fieldwork. So today I'll be starting our discussion, or rather furthering our discussion of climate and crisis framings by talking about public deficits in the backyard, decarbonization versus democratization and energy infrastructure conflicts. So I situate the broader question of energy infrastructure siting within 2 crisis framings, 2 among many. The first is the urgent need to decarbonize our energy systems, what is often evoked as a need for fast policy for energy transitions. I'm going to assume that I do not need to elaborate on this crisis for this audience here today. This need for fast policy, however, is sometimes in tension with the slow work of public participation. Drawing from scholar activist work on energy democracy, I refer to this as a democratization crisis, the need for more just, inclusive, and participatory decision-making in energy governance as a mechanism for promoting the just part of just energy transitions and counterbalancing the entrenched interests of incumbents, especially fossil fuel interests. These two crisis framings are often evoked as competing within a chronopolitics of climate action that sees the slow work of public participation as an unaffordable luxury, even a handicap amidst the time crunch of climate change. Skolsvold and Conan note that the lack of enough time has been identified not only as deprioritizing public participation, but in delegitimizing it, so that the mandate for public participation is seen as naive or even unethical in the rush for decarbonization. One way in which this tension between the need for fast policy for decarbonization and the slow work of public participation takes shape is through the discourse of climate NIMBYism, a pejorative explanation for local resistance to low carbon energy projects, usually deployed against wealthier white communities in the global north. The assumption implicit in accusations of climate NIMBYism is that so-called NIMBYs are irrational, ignorant, or dangerously self-interested in the face of the climate crisis. So briefly unpacking climate NIMBYism, we can see that this discourse works through 2 main implications. The first is an implicit scalar argument that the backyard is an inappropriate scalar framing through which to evaluate the impacts of energy infrastructure projects. Instead, the discourse of NIMBYism implies that these projects should be evaluated at regional, national, or planetary scales. The second is an implicit argument about expertise, where the public lacks the training and big picture thinking to properly and fully participate in energy decision-making. They are disqualified by their inappropriate attachments to local scalar framings and their lack of knowledge on the complexity of energy systems, laws, and climate science. Instead, the discourse of NIMBYism implies that planning for energy futures must be left to experts, energy capital, the state, and grid operators, in my case. So what I refer to here as a crisis of democratization points to the power of incumbent interests and status quo governance procedures that entrenched existing power dynamics, fuel sources, and priorities in our energy systems. In this framing, participation is not a luxury or a handicap, but an index of the relationships between technoscience and democracy, and the means through which societies legitimate claims to both political and epistemic authority, a dynamic particularly evident in infrastructure planning and permitting. So I theorize this crisis of democratization by drawing on process framings of energy democracy, following Suzeki and Overland. which emphasize the redistribution of decision-making power and energy governance as a means of challenging energy incumbents and thus pursuing both democratization and decarbonization of our energy systems. Participation in this view is both a worthwhile goal in and of itself and a means through which to accomplish other goals that might otherwise be blocked by the status quo. So, amidst these competing crisis framings, in light of energy democracy's emphasis on incumbents and against the assumptions of climate NIMBYism, I want to shift our attention to a different kind of actor, energy capital. I use the lens of social legitimacy to consider decarbonization and democratization in productive tension, to ask how energy capital navigates the politics of social legitimacy under energy transitions. This dynamic can take multiple forms, but here I focus on one arrangement, where energy systems are primarily planned and operated by private capital that pursues profits by building and running energy infrastructure. At the same time, we see the increasing role of the state at multiple levels in response to the decarbonization crisis, directly intervening in energy markets and systems by subsidizing and procuring low-carbon energy infrastructure. So the rest of this presentation asks us to consider to what extent delays in new low-carbon energy infrastructure should be attributed to uncooperative publics or to uncooperative capital. Argue that fast policies for decarbonization are slowed not just by public participation. It takes at least two to argue. By reading local opposition as an expression of the democratization of energy governance beyond incumbents, delays in decarbonization can and should also be attributed to energy capital's reluctance to acquiesce to the conditions for public and especially local acceptability. Conditions raised through participatory mechanisms that must be managed by capital, often in participation with the state, to maintain the social legitimacy of its for-profit infrastructure. I developed this argument through the example of a controversial high-voltage transmission line in the northeastern United States and the NIMBYs that eventually succeeded in killing the project. First, however, I want to be reflexive about my argument in my case study. So in a panel on climate crisis, why bother centering the concerns of overwhelmingly white, though socioeconomically diverse, communities in rural parts of the global north over a transmission line, which is generally seen as visual pollution rather than a danger to human health and more than human ecologies. The point I want to emphasize here is a pragmatic one. The US is a current and historic major emitter of carbon. The dominant policy imaginary for reducing those emissions is through the massive build out of new low carbon generation and the associated infrastructure to get it to market. Because of the makeup of the US energy sector, this build out will largely be done through for-profit investments in new infrastructure, often through subsidies or power purchasing agreements with federal, state, and local governments. And because of the land use requirements of renewable energy sources like solar and wind, this build-out and its landscape transformations will largely take place in rural America. If we assume that some degree of public involvement in energy governance, rather than pure technocracy, is necessary and just, the success of communities in resisting new energy infrastructure suggests that improved public participation and the planning, siting, and permitting of these projects is a prerequisite for energy transitions, not just an obstacle or a competing interest. Building projects on schedule, and even at all, depends on the successful legitimation of the project with communities through mechanisms of public participation. So, without further ado, my case study. The Northern Pass project was an 192-mile high-voltage transmission line through the US state of New Hampshire, developed by Eversource, a major utility, in partnership with Hydro-Quebec as the energy source, Quebec being the Canadian province immediately to the north. Originally conceived as a merchant project, a speculative for-profit venture, it eventually received a power purchasing agreement with the state of Massachusetts to meet its decarbonization targets, Massachusetts being the state immediately to the south. Had it been constructed, Northern Pass would have supplied roughly half of the electricity used in Massachusetts from Quebecois hydroelectricity, a socially and ecologically contentious energy source, but a low-carbon one. However, 1 week after receiving the contract with Massachusetts, its final remaining permit was denied by the New Hampshire State Siting Board, killing the project, in large part as the result of 8 years of contestation by local communities in the state. So for the rest of this presentation, I present an alternative reading of this local opposition, not as irrational NIMBYs, but as publics exercising their right to participate in democratic permitting processes and communicate their criteria for local support for the project. Following a process reading of energy democracy that focuses on the role of participation in challenging incumbents, I position this would-be NIMBYism as a contest between these local publics and energy capital over the conditions for social legitimacy. So, first, I explore why the developers believe Northern Pass would already be publicly acceptable without engaging in more extensive community consultation. Then I unpack NIMBY demands, not as irrational, but as criteria for local acceptability and support. I then consider to what extent these demands were reasonable, and then conclude by considering why developers did not meet these demands, ultimately resulting in the cancellation of the project when its final permit was rejected. So first, Northern Pass was initially conceived as part of New Hampshire's Climate Action Plan, which brought together roughly 24 state agency heads and other powers that be in the New Hampshire environmental and energy sphere, including utility executives. One of its no regrets policy recommendations was the development of a new transmission line to increase hydropower imports from Quebec. When Northern Pass was initially planned and announced as a merchant project, therefore, it was acting under the assumption that it already had the implicit support of the New Hampshire state government and the environmental interests the plan framed itself as championing. In this case, committing the classic blunder of mistaking bureaucratic support with support from communities on the ground, who were not engaged in the writing of the Climate Action Plan. Its later success in the Massachusetts clean energy procurement further cemented this idea that Northern Pass was meeting social and policy goals, both in its decarbonizing capacity and through the contract's criteria for community engagement and permitting risk. However, the contract procurement process was designed to facilitate a project much farther upstream in its planning timeline, to guarantee a revenue stream against which a project could secure upfront capital investment. Because Northern Pass had been in development for almost 10 years at the time of the request for proposals, the set of requirements did not align with its development stage. So the extent of its public opposition went uncaptured by how the RFP assessed permitting risk, leading to a project that could check all the boxes for the mitigation of permitting risk, even as it was 7 days from permit rejection. Northern Pass's success in the Massachusetts procurement process also constituted a sense of the project as a deal between Eversource, Hydro-Quebec, and the state of Massachusetts, with New Hampshire serving only as a pass-through. What we might call this contract gaze saw social legitimacy defined through a power purchasing agreement, constraining the developer's view of the relevant stakeholders. Conceived of as an extension cord, the developer viewed the impacts of the project in terms of the energy and emissions reductions delivered to Massachusetts and the profits made for Eversource and Hydro-Quebec, but not in terms of the communities in New Hampshire expected to host the infrastructure. The communities involved objected to seeing their landscapes as an extension cord. Drawing from interviews and document analysis of the Northern Pass opposition, I highlight two main demands of NIMBY opponents. The first was a push beyond the decide, announce, defend model of infrastructural development in favor of one where host communities are consulted in advance of project announcements and their concerns and needs are incorporated in the design of the infrastructure and compensation packages. I learned in a previous session that this is called anticipatory engagement. This decide, announce, defend model was facilitated in part by the use of existing rights of way owned by the developer, some dating back 70 years to rural electrification in the state, so that the developer already had access to most of the land necessary to construct the line. All it needed was the permits to do so. The second demand was complete burial of the line. Burial was taken as the baseline for acceptability by communities, mitigating the visual and many of the ecological impacts of building an 192-mile linear infrastructure bisecting the state. While the initial plan was entirely above ground, in 2015, the final route included 60 miles of burial. However, this was not perceived as a concession to community concerns and was instead seen as a strategic retreat by the developer. So 8 miles were buried in Coos County, where a contiguous route of new rights of way could not be acquired, forcing it to bury the line under state roads. 52 miles were buried through the White Mountain National Forest as a condition for a Forest Service special use permit, also routed primarily under state roads. This burial through the National Forest was also widely perceived as a divide and conquer strategy, as it buried the line through the wealthy towns of Sugar Hill, Franconia, and Easton, while leaving it above ground in poorer towns, particularly in Coos County, which has the lowest median household incomes in the state. So were these demands reasonable, or did they reflect a public deficit model where local communities lack expertise and big picture vision? For the sake of time, I'll focus here on the issue of line burial. This demand arose early and often in the opposition, within a few months of the project's formal announcement in 2010, to the extent that the most active listserv for the opposition was even called Bury Northern Pass. Burial was positioned as a universal best practice necessary for meeting the conditions of local acceptability. Line burial was a known technology, though more common in Europe and other parts of the US, so universal best practice is probably a stretch. However, it was definitively not a novel technology. The main concern was cost, though determining the exact cost of burial versus above grounding is difficult. The developer's initial statements that the undergrounding would be up to 6 times as expensive was not held out in the price increases after Eversource agreed to bury 60 miles of the route. According to an alternative study as part of its federal permit process, the Department of Energy determined that full undergrounding would cost slightly under $2 billion, compared to the final price tag of $1.6 billion. Communities also noted that the cost of burial was shaped by the precise route. So the developer chose to bury the line under state roads that were largely unimproved, with bedrock close to the surface, which added significantly to the cost of undergrounding. Burial is much cheaper under land that has been previously softened. So partially as a reflection of these factors and partially to co-locate transmission along existing linear infrastructure, local opponents lobbied for and eventually got passed designated transmission corridors down New Hampshire's 3 interstate highways, including Interstate 93, which parallels the route of Northern Pass. So over there, for folks who can see my clicker. So these designated corridors were intended to streamline the permitting of transmission by indicating a route that had essentially been pre-approved by the public. So read in this light, NIMBY concerns seem less like the enemy of fast policy and more like the price of doing business, particularly when that business involves citing linear infrastructure. So-called NIMBY demands were communicated early and consistently, reflecting knowledge of technologies used in similar projects elsewhere, and even incentivized through state policies designed to streamline alternative routes. So why didn't the developer make these concessions? My interview participants argue that this was driven by a desire for profit that prevailed over the desire to maximize public acceptability of projects to mitigate permitting risk. Burial is more expensive than above grounding, and burial under Interstate 93 would have involved paying for new rights of way from the State Department of Transportation, whereas the developer could use its existing rights of way for free. As this interview participant argues, what Northern Pass was really about was not renewable energy, but the desire to make money through capital projects, which he connects to a need to incentivize investment in energy infrastructure in some other way. So, framed this way, accusations of climate NIMBYism are a way of delegitimizing public participation. You don't need to listen to NIMBYs. In fact, the crisis of decarbonization perhaps demands that you should ignore them. So this top quote is from a New York Times article on the transmission line that succeeded Northern Pass for the Massachusetts contract, which saw its permits revoked by a citizen referendum. So says a policy think tank, this referendum sets the precedent that voters can block these really important infrastructure projects. That's not good for climate overall. But if voters shouldn't be able to make decisions on infrastructure, then who should? This bottom quote reflects on current efforts to change the New Hampshire state permitting body that ultimately killed Northern Pass by denying its state permit. This reflects a broader push for permitting reform at state and federal levels across the United States, which view delays as a problem routed in public participation rather than in project developers who fail to meet the conditions of public acceptability necessary to secure the social license to operate in host communities. What gives me hope, however, are projects that have arisen in the wake of Northern Pass that appear to take local acceptability and permitting risk more seriously. The Twin States Clean Energy Link is buried in Vermont before crossing into New Hampshire, where it utilizes a reconductoring technology along an existing line to increase its transmission capacity without expanding the visual and spatial footprint of the corridor. Prior to the project announcement, the developer held meetings with every town along the route, preempting community concerns and developing tailored community compensation packages that went beyond a declining return on property taxes. These concessions made the project more expensive. The current sticker price is around $2 billion. But 2 weeks ago, the project was awarded federal funding through the DOE's Transmission Facilitation Program, in large part in recognition of this degree of community engagement and participation. So while the exact value of this award has not yet been announced, I take Twin States as a possible new paradigm for the social legitimacy of low carbon infrastructure, where developers see public demands and participation not as an obstacle to be steamrolled, but the price of doing business. And the state recognizes its role in stewarding both decarbonization and democratization and energy planning. So I'll conclude with this word of warning from one stalwart opponent of Northern Pass, reflecting on his years of struggle with the energy planning and permitting process. What worries him is that the rush for renewables will be taken advantage of by utilities to build whatever they can make money on, rather than something that will really transform the grid. That nothing will change, that permitting will be relaxed to push through poorly sited projects, that the powers that be won't really be committed to decarbonization. They'll be committed to making money, and they'll leverage well-intentioned programs to do so. Thanks.
Thank you, Maddie. We do have 5 minutes for any questions from the audience or the other presenters as well. Salah and Dr. Edwards, if you'd like to ask any questions.
I'll jump in. Maddie, that was great. I really enjoyed that. Very, very interesting. I did wonder, you're looking at very particular cases, and that's of course normal. But there is, in this case, it didn't seem like there was a sort of hidden agenda lobby lurking out there that was going to try to deep six this project for other reasons. As there is with a lot of renewable energy projects, especially wind power, there are these people going around trying to provoke local communities into viewing those negatively for reasons that have to do with fossil fuel company interests. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether you saw anything like that in this case, or whether it's happening. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Dr. Edwards. And that's an excellent plug to the presentation I'll be giving here in 6 months at the American Association of Geographers meeting. So a dynamic that's been coming up more in my other case study for the dissertation that's in Maine, but also was present in New Hampshire, was what one of my interview participants called utility on utility violence. So in that version of the story, the project was killed by competing utilities who saw their profits threatened by this new project. So the big bad guy here is basically the nuclear power plant in New Hampshire. Don't quote me on that. But the idea there being that these groups, in part emboldened by the Citizens United Supreme Court decision from a few years back, basically they don't create opposition. The opposition is already there, in part because of these poor public engagement and a general intense distrust of these utility companies. But even these well-intentioned, long pedigreed environmental groups like the Sierra Club is involved, right? They can't stop fossil fuel and nuclear money from spending money on ads that they happen to agree with. So it gets, so the argument there that I'm developing through the next couple months of field work is really looking at how it's not a binary between like genuine grassroots opposition and astroturfing. But there's this strategic way in which competing utilities can leverage the mandate for public participation to kill projects and therefore harm the decarbonization crisis. And so my argument there, sort of drawing from this presentation, is that if we can, do that anticipatory engagement so that communities aren't mad, then you lose that lever for energy capital to kill those projects and delay decarbonization in the region. So thank you.
Thanks.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Doesn't look like it, but I'm happy to chat later. We all have the benefit of being able to get coffee afterwards.
Okay. I do have a question, if that's all right. Yeah. So, thanks for the presentation, Maddie. It was a great paper to read as well. Thanks for that. So, your whole sort of argument is based on how community engagement is shaped and navigated through this sort of give and take and highlighting the whole NIMBYs yeah. So I was wondering. I was hoping if you'd sort of clarify how the environment impact assessment process usually is in the US and the level of community engagement in the process and how it sort of ties to your argument. Because, if there is a certain way that community engagement usually happens in with these kind of projects, and but I feel like your talk implies that this process is not followed and hence it deviates from this process. I was wondering if you could give a broader picture of that, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll say I'm not a particular expert in especially the federal environmental impact assessment process. I'll I'll leave that to other folks in the room who might be, I've primarily been working at the subnational level. I'll say that this points to Professor Edwards' point about the particularity of my project. So high voltage transmission lines are not generally seen as an environmental burden in the same way that like a gas pipeline would be. And that's correct. They're very much not an environmental burden in the same way. So a lot of the concerns that were raised about the environment, there were some about forest fragmentation. There are major concerns about how the environmental permits in my other case study are not being followed in Maine and the threat that poses to watersheds. But it's the primary concern was a visual one. And so what opponents were able to use was this argument about cultural landscapes, so more under historical preservation front. So sort of a different regime of public involvement and commentary. And a lot of that is through part of a sort of culture of grid planning that is not used to having to deal with public engagement, in part because we don't build this scale of transmission line very often. And it has been many years, and the regulatory regime and the market regime has changed quite a bit, especially in New England. So you have developers who started their career in a natural monopoly model who are now in a competitive model, which much more state involvement, having to sort of make that paradigm shift, which is part of where I see hope in the example of the Twin States. I had one interview participant even told me that he thought it reflected the fact that new developers are reading the social science literature on energy studies, which I'm not sure I believe they're reading the social science literature on energy, but I would like to think they are, because that would make me feel better about how I spend my time. But I'll leave it at that.
Right. Great. Thanks for answering that question, Maddie. So let's move on to the next speaker, Dr. Edwards. The floor is yours.
Are you seeing my screen the way my slides?
Yes, yes.
I can no
And
longer
we are,
see.
we're seeing them in the room, so.
Yes, and only that, but not something else too, because I'm doing it.
We can only see your slides, so you're good.
Right. Okay, perfect. Well, so thank you all for being here and for listening to this today. I'm doing this as this particular talk kind of as a spur toward a much bigger project that I've been working on for a while. This is a piece of it. I've been fascinated with the character of human time for a long time, so to speak, and that it has been something driven by my interest in climate science and my participation in climate science over the last 30 years. So today, what I want to do is begin with this cartoon, which actually shows what my partner Gabrielle Hecht would call an interscalar vehicle. This is the vehicle in this case is the globe, and it's got these people. It's a family road trip going on a trip through the into the Anthropocene, out of the Holocene. That's kind of what this talk is about. It's trying to look at different scales of time and how people experience them. And Hema, I want to thank you for the way you set up the session, because I hope that this will at least speak to some of the things that you said. Okay, so let me start with this event. So in 2003, there was a heat wave in Europe. The strongest part of it was in Eastern France, but it affected the UK and Eastern Europe and some other parts of Europe as well. In France, 30,000 people died of that in that heat because unusually heat remained even at night, and the system for cooling buildings in that area has typically been that they're made of stone and they don't retain that much heat and get a chance to cool down at night. But when the nighttime cooling doesn't come, they can become extremely dangerous, since they do not have air conditioning. So this heat wave caused economic losses in excess of 9 billion euros. About a year later, this study of that heat wave appeared. And what it did was to look at I hope you can see my cursor. Here is the heat wave itself, this spike of temperature. What they've done is to model European summer temperatures on the IPCC SRES A2 scenario, and then just kind of look at where that event falls in this time, in this future time that they're projecting outward. So what it shows, if we just draw a line over to 2050, it's saying that the temperatures of 2003 that was a heat wave, but they will be normal temperatures by 2050 and cool temperatures by 2080 on this emissions scenario. So this is the first attempt at what came to be known as event attribution. That's an outgrowth of something in climate science that's been going on for a very long time, which is the attempt to attribute climate change to human activity. And mostly in the past, that took place through at the global scale. And so here we have a slide. This has been done many times now from the CMIP experiment sets. The black line here is observations. The red and blue lines show model runs of Earth without human greenhouse gases. So basically, they've taken the situation as it existed in about 1860, the gas concentration of the atmosphere, and just left it stable throughout this entire period, whereas in the real world, people were introducing more and more greenhouse gases over time, and temperatures were also rising. So what this attribution graph shows is that had we not injected the many billions of tons of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that have gone into the atmosphere, according to models, temperatures would have remained relatively flat. And an interesting feature of this is that there are a few moments where there are major volcanic eruptions, such as here, Krakatoa, and up here, Pinatubo in the early 1990s. And the models reproduce those drops just like they should. So back to event attribution. This is the time frame I'm interested in right now. So the European heat wave was an extreme weather event, and that 2004 study I showed you was the first one of those. Others came, and by 2012, the main journal of this field, the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, started to publish reviews of all these attribution studies that had been done over that year. Not all of them, actually, but a sampling from all over the world. In 2015, the goal of this project changed from just doing a scientific study that would take a year to publish and come out later and be of interest mainly to scientists, to the goal of attributing an event very rapidly within a few days, so that while it was still news, scientists could publish something about what degree they could attribute, what amount of that event they could attribute to human activity. There was the World National Academy of Sciences study, and then in the 21-22 IPCC report that I was involved in, event attribution was assessed like the other much longer timescales of attribution that have gone on throughout the history of climate science. So now we are in a phase where we have what you might call operational extreme event attribution. The first episode that was done this way was the storm, actually second, the storm Desmond, which occurred during the Paris Climate Conference on December 5th. They leapt into action, they produced an assessment of it, and you see the headline, Storm Desmond rainfall partly due to climate change. So they were able to do that in 5 days and get it out during the Paris Climate Conference as a way to affect the meeting. This book on the right, Freddie Otto's book, Angry Weather, And you see her pictured down there in the lower corner. She is an amazing person, a one-woman army who has really been leading this. She's only 41, I just found out, which just boggles my mind because of all she's done in this area. So what is this science and what does it do? I'll get back to time in a minute, but so, there are lots of extreme events. There have always been extreme events. And we hear phrases like 100-year storms, 500-year storms, events that are very rare because they're so extreme for some particular place. So extreme event attribution begins by defining the event, collecting data. So you need a beginning and an end time. You need a spatial region that you're going to look at, and then collecting data about that event, and then comparing the likelihood of the event or the intensity of the event or both to their intensity in a kind of control Earth. And finally, evaluating statistical return time. So maybe the once every 100-year event is now going to happen once every 10 years. Let's make a statement like that. So there are different modes of this sort of study. And that first one we looked at followed this technique. So what is the probability today versus the past? Event X was Y% more likely than in some counterfactual natural world without human influence. So this green curve here might be seen as that control Earth graph I showed you earlier. So then what's the difference between the natural world, because it's a model, and the actual world of today? Then you can compare these two probability distribution functions. You might find that nothing has changed. So negative results are possible and have been published. It's not necessarily true that any given extreme event is an effect of climate change. And I think part of the reason for this, the popularity of this approach now, is that we so often see in the news and on social media people attributing for themselves extreme events to climate change. And many probably are attributable to climate change, but often there's no real science behind it. It's just now our reflex to say this extreme event is probably a climate effect. So again, that's what this first attribution study showed. Right. So one thing that people can do with event attribution, and they're moving in this direction now, and this kind of speaks to some of the things that Hema was talking about earlier. So far, it's just science. We're just saying, what's the probability that this is happening now, will happen more often in the future? But another thing that can be done is to compare what today's damages from some particular event were versus what were the damages of some similar event in the past. And that begins to give us a way to say, to quantify damages and potentially in a way that courts would be open to hearing as evidence. So as everyone knows, once you can put a money figure on something, it becomes much more powerful in a legal context or any other context, really. And there's a lot of hope in this community that we can use this technique to move from just, a kind of view of climate activists as wild-eyed people who are just saying that everything is climate change, to an actually judicial approach to loss and damage, both in the framework of the Framework Convention and in the courts. So now let me turn to what is really, my own interest today in this talk. It's I think this stuff is all fascinating, and I can talk about the science some more later, but what kind of temporality is this? So any extreme event of that sort, if you've ever lived through a thing like that, you know that it was an experience of crisis. It might have affected you as a kind of adventure if you got through it okay and you just saw all the madness happening around you, but it could also be an experience of terrible loss or tragedy. And there's always an aftermath that mostly doesn't get reported, where things are cleaned up and repaired or not, and leaves a lasting mark. So these events take place, on the scale mostly of hours to weeks. So rainfall, hurricanes, floods, heat waves. Droughts are longer. They can last for years and sometimes becomes quasi-permanent. I would say those are less event-like from the human point of view. So another kind of time in this domain is what you could call science time. And that's the process of doing a serious study of an event, collecting the data, running the models, doing these comparisons. You can do it in a few days, but to satisfy scientists, you have to peer review it. And that means you have to get into the journal queue. And as we all know, that can take at least a year, and often does. So by the time the publication happens, the event has receded from the foreground of experience for the people to whom it happened and doesn't appear as a headline. And then the last thing I want to point to is what you could call climate time. I don't know if you can see this video down in the lower right. I'll just tell you what that is first. It's a stop action video of a glacier in Alaska over a 10-year period. And you'll see it empty out, and then they'll kind of show you what the original extent was and how much was lost across that relatively short time frame. Usually that's not actually climate time for a scientist. So for a scientist, climate is at least a 30-year average. And of course, one of the issues we have now in science is that since it's changing rapidly, waiting 30 years for an average doesn't help us that much. And that's why there's this kind of attempt to rely on models and think about, well, if we model out the next 30 years of climate, what's going to be the normal course of the new normal, as it were, over that time frame? But from a scientific point of view, usually this record is at least 100 years. They go back millions of years. And that sort of time has not much to do with most people's ordinary experience. Your own lifetime is probably the full extent of your experience of time, and you can hear about things from other people, gain memories, read stories about events that happened in the past, and have a kind of surrogate experience of time that way. But in terms of this very long time frame, what we mostly get are graphs that move up and to the right. And I show these things all the time in my classrooms, and yet I'm constantly wondering, how effective is that as a communication technique for people who are not, like me, deeply immersed in this science? So, if we put this on a bar chart, we see that the event time of 3 weeks barely even shows up. Science time is a tiny blip, and the climate time can go way, way, way beyond that. One of the best ways of representing this graphically that I've seen is this chart that we did in the sixth assessment report, which frames the changes in climate in terms of a lifetime of someone who lives to be 70 or more. So I'm down here in the bottom. I'm 65. I'm my life will be over before some of the more extreme changes have happened. But people who are being born today will still be alive in 2100 or beyond. Another way to imagine time, and I think this is one of the roles of event attribution, is to create the possibility for a new kind of narrative time about climate change. So people may know the Ministry of the Future, the Kim Stanley Robinson novel, set really in the, it was published a few years ago, set essentially in the present today, that begins with this terrifying wet bulb event. That's an event when the temperature is above 35 degrees centigrade and it's very humid. So your body, at that temperature and humidity, your body can't cool itself. So if you are outside with no shelter and no way to cool yourself, you'll slowly cook until you die. And in this narration, that's what happens to tens of thousands of people in a certain area of, I believe it happens in India. So now we're in a situation where Freddie and her group have formed this operational World Weather Attribution Center, which essentially churns out these rapid studies of particular events. We saw the Desmond study. The scientific concerns about that have been mostly resolved by publishing them all later with peer review, but you still do it up front. So that we go from a climate time that was always, the long graph up and to the right, to something that is much more focused on things that people are experiencing at different parts of the world on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So this, to me, is a scientific version of an interscalar vehicle. It lets us take our experience of something very salient and memorable and place it in the context of the longer term change that is hard to understand and perceive and very abstract, especially when it's framed only and mainly in terms of global temperature. Okay, so I did not time this talk, but miraculously, I think I've come in just under the wire, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. You do have a couple of more minutes if you'd like to sort of tie it together and conclude it.
Sure. I'd love to hear people's thoughts and questions.
Right,
Make
great.
sense to you.
I'm just gonna flag, we're gonna switch Salah's computer on, so I believe we should be able to still hear you, but if there's shuffling, that's what's going on here.
Okay.
Can I maybe jump in?
Please.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. That was a very interesting presentation, and also just like walked me through the science part of it so well. I'm actually trying to connect. Is it better now? Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So I'm actually trying to connect, yours and Maddie's paper, because I come at it nowhere from the perspective of climate science. I actually work primarily on AI, and right now, some of the work that I'm doing focuses on sort of why do we need to centralize publics, right, to our questioning of technology, to our questioning of the climate crisis, and so on and so forth, right? The politics of the publics and why that becomes important. And I think in Madeline's paper, what I found interesting was, how she, when talking about, talking against the criticisms as to, this public deficit and people's lack of knowledge about projects, and that might slow things down. And then the quip that she has there is that if not the voters, then who? Right. So, sorry. I'll try again. So, and then when it comes to your talk and your paper, when you're talking towards the end about, how people's experiences of events and how we portray them and how we communicate them can actually be very valuable in how, in terms of, how we imagine how we imagine climate time or do time travel across different scenarios. So what's interesting to me, and perhaps this is more, it's somewhere in between a question and a comment, pardon that. But what's interesting to me really is, in terms of how we need to often bring the public back into the conversation, and that could, in certain projects, the justification takes the angle of a more democratic participation of citizens. But when you're talking about things that are global and planetary in scope, right, that fallback to, if not the voters, then who, becomes really difficult for us, right? Because there is almost an immediate legitimacy that comes with being a citizen, a voter, and therefore having rights of democratic participation within a particular polity and within a particular economic structure. So my question to you really is, if you could share some thoughts on this kind of legitimizing of people's experiences, almost what sort of an imagination of a global publics do you see emerging within this? Because unlike, governments have multinational forums that they can all join together, be a part of, and there is that lens, there's a sense of legitimacy at an intergovernmental setup, right, at that level. But when it comes down to people and people's experiences, there is maybe a narrative of, one world, one kind of, that it affects us all. But beyond that, are there instruments, conceptual paradigms that help us make a stronger case for inclusion of global publics into the conversation, right? That is beyond citizenship.
Yeah, well, that's why I think the move toward assessing damages from individual events has the potential to be very powerful, because it means that any given place where that happened could potentially approach its government. And this is happening now. I mean, there are thousands of climate lawsuits going on all over the world at this moment. Could potentially approach its government and with a damage claim that is concrete and quantitative. They can say, we were hurt by this, and you, the government, are not protecting us, so you need to do that. Or they could sue fossil fuel companies or some other actor, depending on what it is. Perhaps, in the case of a dam that breaks, the company that runs the dam might be sued because it didn't attend to the, changes in the climate that were going to affect it. So it starts to put us into a world where it's not just kind of a vague global concern, but much more of at least a regional, and potentially a local concern that people can get a grip on from a scientific point of view. There's no guarantee that courts will, accept evidence like that, because models are always a part of it, and it's very easy to challenge models, and they are not perfect. But I think the way this science is being done holds out a lot of hope for that hurdle could be overcome.
Thank you for that. I mean, yeah, this idea of different scales of experiences and bringing that in through more concrete sort of assessments, I think is a really useful way to think about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Angelina, for the question. Thank you, Dr. Edwards.
Let me just say one more thing, and then I'll stop. Another direction that damage assessment can go is toward the unbelievable injustice of this situation, where the global north and the developed world is much more responsible for climate change than the developing world. But the developing world and the global south are suffering the worst of consequences. So here too, it's easy to make the claim that they're suffering that the global south is suffering consequences, but it's a more powerful claim if you can quantify it. And that's one of the things that this can do.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Batika, are there any questions from the audience? Mhm.
Are there any questions in the back? Okay, no questions here.
Okay, let's move on.
Oh, okay. I did have a question, Dr. Edwards. So it's very interesting how you've sort of brought out the history of, attribution science um, and how it sort of connects to the idea of the future itself, right? So, I mean, if you look at the history of climate activism and the kind of um, narratives they've been mobilizing, right? So the idea of living in the future and time itself progressing has become sort of a scary idea, right? I mean, and this I feel is really interesting and important to also explore in the context of what it does to the emotions, what it does to the idea of the future of people who currently in their primes and who are now in the space of shaping the world, right? So which is what sort of the climate alarmists have been mobilizing for so long, right? And then you're bringing up this attribution science and saying that, hey, this is something that is constructed, not just and maybe I'm reading it wrong, but I was wondering if you had any comments about how this sort of pans out in terms of future imaginaries, right? And imaginaries is such a strong and evocative term to sort of keep going forward, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's a really, really hard one. I mean, I wrestle with this all the time. I'm teaching a class right now where students are, some of the students are get really depressed by hearing the news. And I mean, I think there's sort of two poles usually. One is we're hearing from climate scientists about emergency and crisis all the time, and it makes us feel like there's no future, doom is coming, there's nothing we can do about it, we might as well just keep driving our cars and all that. And then the other is you have to hold out hope for people. We can still make it inside the 1.5 degree limit, and discourses like that I find rather thin these days. I think there's another way, and it's not an easy way, but it's different from both of those. And that is just, the acceptance that this is where we are. So it's climate change is no longer a thing that's coming. It's here. Our normal is going to keep changing as we continue, as time goes on. And let's, instead of just feeling fear and despair in the face of that, let's think about how we deal with it and adapt. So this is one of the things that's been going on in the IPCC forever at this point, is that the people who work on adaptation always feel like the people who work on mitigation are running the ship. And they're still stuck, in the 1990s when we could have done enough to really keep ourselves from going over these imaginary lines. So the adaptation people will say, this is happening, let's figure it out. Let's rethink economics and real estate and all the things that go into our infrastructure, all the things that go into our societies, and do it in a calm way, because this is what we're dealing with. So I don't know if that really solves the problem, but it's one way of thinking about it.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Thank you for the presentation as well. So moving on to our next speaker, Salah Hamtoon. Over to you, Salah. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's obviously an honor to speak after such great presentations. Thank you so much, Maddie. Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Salah. Oh, am I not showing my screen? Oh. First things first. Yeah.
That's what you want us to see.
Yeah,
Perfect.
I just wanted to have it on. Yeah, I'll just drag it. Yeah, a warm aloha from here. Let me see my text.
We're only seeing part of your.
Wow.
Here.
Okay, this is not going as I just
I feel you.
give me a minute. I thought I had this figured out, but
Yes, thank you. Just put here.
okay.
Stella, would you like me to share your presentation?
You know what? That may be, yeah, that may work. Yeah, I can just do the next slide. Yeah, that's perfect.
Should I? Okay.
Oh, yes, you can go ahead. Yeah,
Okay, just give me a second.
this is dual screen.
Second. Right. Let me know when you'd like me to move on to the next. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, great. Just a second.
Back. Wow, what an organization. Yeah.
Oh, that's what you want to see.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, then I have my own. Perfect. Thank you, Ima. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Warm aloha. I'm Salah. I'm a PhD candidate at Arizona State University in the Innovation and Global Development program. I'm currently in my last phase. I just finished my field work, so I'm very happy to focus on the remainder, which is analysis and writing. This particular presentation is basically a thought experiment. It's a spin-off on one of the parts of my dissertation, and basically came to the foreground after more recent events such as the earthquake in Turkey, beginning of the year, recent earthquake in Morocco, earthquake in Afghanistan. So all of these things shaped my my reading of what is going on, and I'll elaborate further in the presentation. But I think a relevant element here is that before I started my academic career, I was trading in foreign exchange. I was in financial markets, trading in bonds, basically ensuring that the bank would remain afloat. I did that in Amsterdam and in the Middle East, and basically had to deal with regulations coming from Central Bank of England, Basel III regulations. And I mentioned this because it's relevant to the story, not because I want to share some of my expertise here. You can go to the next slide. Hima?
Yeah.
I forgot to mention the artist that was on the first slide, Adrian Arias. I took that picture in San Francisco this week, just before I flew to Hawaii. And in Spanish, what it says is, "Dear angel, do not try to colonize me." And I thought it was an extremely powerful message and very relatable to this presentation and us being here. Anyway, so slide number 2. So the theme of today is finance and earthquakes and risks. It didn't only attract my attention because of the constant mismatch between the actual event and what we call then the emergency, the moment that we all have to pay attention. We all have to pay attention to the action, and and basically, an action is required from us. We all have to pay attention, and action is required from us, right? So there's a time frame, as Dr. Edwards already mentioned, and in that time frame, people are expected to respond. Now, there's often a mismatch between the event itself and when we call it the emergency. It can be beforehand, can be while it's unfolding, or it can happen afterwards. It's not always clear. Disasters, it seems, then became an effort to constantly match to the event and create a narrative around this. And you may wonder why I put this picture out there, because it's really about the imagination, right? What's central in this story of mine today is the idea of boundaries, ideas and perceptions influencing other ways of thinking, other ways of understanding, other ways of perceiving society, as a result of the laws and regulations that we introduce in society throughout time, and some of them actually fade in the background. We wouldn't even consider them to be a law that is impacting our lives. It's just something that we accept as normal. But before I introduce the cases that I want to talk about, I want to share a bit of a background and explain how this question particularly was shaped. And Hima, can you go to the next slide, please? So I look at, so for my larger dissertation project, I explored 3 elements that bring together a study of hermeneutics of development and society, basically an understanding how interventions are experienced and interpreted rather than normatively measured. And I do that to appreciate the history and the way that history shapes our futures. I claim in my work that societies are moving. The societies are moving, and obviously that can be because of technology, but also because of regulations and rules and ways that people respond to these regulations and rules. This obviously shapes behavior, invokes response, and in something that Polanyi calls the double movements. Every time there is a new regulation, a new technology introduced in society, people move to push back and basically first to understand what is happening and what that means for their position. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I divided into 3 categories. Oh, back, please. No, back, other way. One more, please. You have to go the other way. Thank you so much. Okay, so I divide these into. You really have to go back. It's not working like this.
Sorry, Sala, do you want me to go back?
Yes, please. Slide 4.
Right. Until it's
There.
Yeah, I think so. Oh yeah, perfect. Yes. Thank you. As technology. Again, so I divided into 3 categories: practice, risk, and renewal, which is partly drawn from Bourdieu's field theory. Let's start with practice. So practice is basically how do people practice really reflects on the history of people, the way that people are prepared for society, the intergenerational influence, the way that we understand society, and the way we basically shape our capital needed to navigate through society. This is where Bourdieu's influence is most clearly there. People's practice is shaped by the history and education. Risk in my work reflects society. People are aware at a point what society is offering them, and then they basically realize the distance between what they have and where they ideally want to be. Some would call it future thinking. We had a discussion yesterday about that. But basically, my idea here is to understand where people are and where they want to be, and what Bourdieu calls the hysteresis. There's a period there where as long as that awareness is there, that people understand it as a way of a period of uncertainty, not really certain what the future will mean for their position. And lastly, renewal. Basically a way for people to capture the discrepancy and respond, right? So to be empowered to navigate and control the distance between where they are and where they want to be. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. And this is what I meant with the spin-off. So again, so in this paper, I'm looking particularly at the ways in which risk is imagined and generally agreed upon, and what the impact therefore is on people's preparation for natural events. By asking the question, how does financialization shape dominating risk perceptions? And what does that mean for distribution of risk in the ways in which people, and in the ways in which society prepares for future disasters? Next slide, please. So I started thinking more deeply about earthquakes, as I mentioned earlier, first after the earthquake in Turkey, and then most recently again in Morocco. But the earthquake in Turkey was particularly interesting because it was massive. It was really hard to imagine what redevelopment would mean after such a disaster. About 60,000 people passed away. I mean, this includes a region of Turkey and Syria. But the idea that about 25,000 buildings collapsed just within a couple of seconds and the days after was just hard to imagine. The following week, however, the vice president announced that there were 113 people in sight and they were ready to be charged, criminally charged. And that was just 4 months before the election. So I thought it was a really nice, interesting set of events coming together. Looking for this question. 4 months later, the sitting government won the election. It was a bit bruised, but they were reelected nonetheless. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. A month later, March 9th, another emergency appeared, the fall of the Silicon Valley Bank. This time the event was a system that broke down, a crisis that again showed the discrepancy between the laws that should be protecting people from speculative actions. Now, this matter was ultimately resolved by the Federal Reserve Bank, but it wasn't clear in this case whether it would address the underlying issue at stake, which is speculation, and the lack of regulation after the set of reductions after the financial crisis. So there were laws introduced that were basically watered down the years after they were introduced during the Trump era and even before. Next slide, please. This is a picture of, this is not a movie, this is a picture of Haiti. And I think finance and earthquakes come really together in Haiti. And I thought this was good to illustrate what kind of disaster can happen when you don't allow for a country to prepare. And this is ever since the inception of Haiti had to deal with debt and basically lagged development for a substantial number of years, not allowing them to prepare and remain vulnerable really throughout still, basically. So these two events, the Silicon Valley and the Turkey earthquake that I focus on in the paper itself, it doesn't seem that they have anything to do with each other at first sight. But what if we start understanding finance not as a way to facilitate, but also as a system that requires to prepare people for extreme events by focusing on people's risk reduction? And what about if we understand earthquakes not simply as a potential disaster, but rather as a measurement for how society is prepared? Finance is a system that governs modernity, enables modernization. It influences acceptable boundaries. It is able to impact laws, behavior, accounting norms, but also influences the acceptable kind of trade. Think about slavery, think about child labor and other conditions. And you will see pushing back against rules and regulations, as we have seen after the financial crisis. Regulations basically that are set to protect people, or part of a political reform. I invoke, therefore, in the paper an overview of what the first years of this global system looks like, what influenced the structure and acceptable norms of specifically the US financial model. What allowed the United States to present a new democratic model of governing, but never escape the British imagination of a financial model, right? So Alexander Hamilton, the treasurer back in the days, he was basically focused on modeling it after the British system. So what is it that normalized the idea of self-regulation eventually? Think about the New York Stock Exchange and the ways in which banks are consistently in crisis, but yet remain following the same pattern of asking government for interventions whenever they need. Next slide, please. The person on the left is not Alexander Hamilton, but it's nice to imagine him as Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton, the treasurer back in the days, didn't think of contracting the role of, sorry, I missed that. Okay, so anyway, so yes, so the United States' first financial crisis in 1792, shortly after the establishment of the first Bank of the United States, was a fact. Key figures like William Dewar and Alexander Macomb led the initial speculative norms into this system by using aggressive trading and borrowing strategies to finance stock purchases, particularly in the Bank of the United States, which created the bubble, and which is driven by widespread belief in the continuous rise of the stock value, facilitated by easy credit conditions of the time. That's something that sounds very familiar. Now, when the bubble burst in March 1792, Dewar and Macomb and their associates could no longer maintain their leveraged positions. Dewar's arrest for debt non-payment to the Treasury was also caused a severe loss in the confidence of the financial markets. The crisis escalated as banks and creditors demanded clients to loan repayments, leading to a widespread liquidation and shortfall that rippled through the economy. Next slide, please. William Dewar is the person on the right, obviously. You know what? You can go to the next slide. Yeah. Yeah. So earthquakes have throughout history shaped the politics of society. I mentioned earlier the earthquake of Turkey. The reason why I found it so profoundly fascinating is that earthquakes causing such disaster become often a political matter, unless the rules are bent and the ways of offering justice can be addressed by criminalization. I address in this paper the ways in which the Prime Minister of Portugal at the time responded to the 1755 disaster. Marquis de Pombal wasn't only concerned about the reconstruction efforts in the aftermath of the earthquake and the tsunami that followed, but he also had to deal with the idea of the imagination, how to match the ways in which earthquakes are interpreted with a focus on modernization of the country. For example, the king asked him the next day, what could be done to combat this infliction of divine justice in the early mornings after the earthquake? So what Pombal was worried about, was in the way in which the earthquake would be perceived, both in Portugal and outside and across the world. First, he sent warships across the world to make sure that foreign territories wouldn't rebel, or that other world powers to take advantage of the instability, and including Goa, by the way. Second, he focused on expertise and he focused on expertise by rationalizing earthquakes and bringing engineers from France, Paris specifically, to measure and understand earthquakes better, but also reconstruct the homes and bringing basically new rules and regulations. Third, he focused on local interpretation by limiting the Jesuits' role in society. The Jesuits were very focused on, well, they were not friends, but they were very focused on making sure that the interpretation of the earthquake would be related to the activities of the Portuguese in the Portuguese court, which includes obviously the idea of divine intervention. For he did what bankers do so well during crisis today, limiting people from moving away to ensure stability and normalcy. Next slide, please. So the way in which these two elements come together is where on one side we have the preparation of people in society, and especially the subaltern communities of what Mahmoud Mamdani calls the political minority. And on the other hand, you have such preparations coinciding with natural events. The capacity to respond is important, but also the ways in which decisions are made. Finance has obviously an economic approach to risk, which is therefore fundamentally different, a different way of understanding and accepting the world. In other words, for finance to relate, it continuously needs to translate its decisions with the impact it makes on society. This economic approach to risk cannot incorporate all these emotions and psychological or social understandings of society. But when it does, it makes an effort, and it in most cases proudly announces it. But that specific detachment, the capacity to detach yourself from society, allows it to remain so fluid. I use various theories to bring this to showcase a much deeper relationship between the preparation and disaster. For example, the first element is vulnerability. The second is order and disorder, and the last that I use is the order and disorder. Lastly is the way in which risk perception further pushes the boundaries and the role of criminalization, as suggested by Mahmoud Mamdani. Next slide, please. So vulnerability. What is the role of finance in impacting people's vulnerabilities or preparation for future disasters? As Arendt suggested, the result of expanding economic interest and the invasion of bureaucracy is concerning, precisely because of what modernization could mean for keeping people disengaged in the political process and the delivery of solutions for the risk that people perceive. Solutions that speak to the prioritization of risk, informed by the way people experience the world. Modernization seems to stress test the protected layer, a layer that Arendt imagined probably as physical and real, the four walls, for example, resembling a home, enforced by all the benefits of the private, a place not only necessary to protect oneself from the expectations of society, but also a minimum requirement to thrive and grow in solitude. I quote, "These four walls within which people's private family life is lived constitute a shield against the world and specifically against the public aspect of the world. They enclose a secure place without which no living thing can thrive. This holds good not only for the life of childhood, but for human life in general, wherever the latter is consistently exposed to the world without the protection of privacy and security. It is a vital quality is then destroyed." Next slide, please. Yes, on the picture on the right, I keep invoking Haididi, and I think that's an excellent case also probably to bring it in. But on the right side, you see how people are prepared for earthquakes, and these obviously there are many elements, but at the source of it all was finance, right? So and I think this is important to note that it has. I'm also dealing with this idea of time, right? So what is the impact of finance over many generations versus the thing that we see in front of us? All right. So this disorder, the second group of theories that we're using. So disorder, what directs the need to address what is experienced as disorder, and who is involved in determining what becomes order? This is where we can sense society moving after a disaster, calling out for a normal. There are two kinds of work that I believe are relevant. First, Bourdieu, who understands movement in society as a way to organize around one's own position, an actor's own position, which can include a person or a bank or other actors in society. What we want is to organize, reduce risk, and take care of the vulnerabilities one is exposed to. But I also find the work of Mary Douglas used in Purity and Danger relevant to both earthquakes and finance. She uses dirt as a metaphor for this disorder to explain people's obsession with the creation of orderly patterns in what is otherwise disorder. Douglas explains that the reflection on dirt involves a reflection on the relation of order to disorder, being to non-being, form to formless, life to death. For her, dirt was an intermediate understanding of nature. There's no dirt except in our imagination, and yet it compels people to respond, perhaps not to dirt, but what dirt represents. Disorder and out of place and no pattern, it's endless. In my work, addressing the idea of order and disorder is therefore a part of an effort to bring the preparation and disaster in a much clearer connection. As I believe it is needed to understand what the new normal is always shaped, as I believe it is needed to understand that the new normal is always shaped, but it's not always clear by who, and to address whose disorder. But it remains relevant given the ways in which the new normal becomes the platform on which vulnerabilities further shape. Next slide, please. Which brings me to the last point. Should we respond to disasters in the same way that finance is responding to its crisis? Mamdani shows in his work that the tension between political reform and criminalization is exactly that. There is no real pathway to inclusion of voices without political reform. It is not so much that he dismisses the function of the judicial system, but when he compares the ways in which ideologies are addressed to relieve the pressure on marginalized communities, it is never through solely focusing on criminalization. He says the political reform has to come first because the call for criminal justice within the parameters of the existing political order leaves that order intact. Next slide, please. So there's of course a lot more to say about this topic, but I hope that I invoked at least some questions around the way in which the relationship between marginalization and vulnerabilities can be found in our history. There are norms that we accept in society that fade into the background and become the nomos. Natural disasters have historically been at the beginning of political reform, and at least the call for political reform is always looming, because suffering and thriving have a profound purpose in future thinking. When criminalization becomes the way to address disasters, it is not only furthering vulnerabilities, as suggested by Arendt, given that it simply broadens scale through bureaucracy, keeping up the kind of risk perceptions, and hence needs to gain access into the private sphere. The criminalization of disasters, without addressing the underlying issues, as Mamdani explains, leaves undisturbed the logic of institutions that make nation-building violence thinkable and possible. Depoliticizing natural disasters complicates the relationship between the underlying issues and the natural event and allows for a continuous repeat for potentially hundreds of years to come. That is the last slide. Oh, no, I have one more slide. Yeah, so yesterday I visited with two of my colleagues, the Bishop Museum here in Honolulu, and I found this particular story very intriguing. And so this is a story about Hina who began to join and beat the tapa. At the time, the sun traveled very fast, therefore Hina's tapas did not dry. Maui of the loincloth became angry with the sun and went to the place where the sun rose. When the first ray pierced upward, he caught it and held it fast. He broke off the ray, causing the sun to travel slowly. And this poetry invoked me because it basically shows that people, that this is the part where there's a distance between where they are and where they want to be. So the sun was not doing what the person wanted. Now, a way to renew then was to take off the sun ray, and then it worked for them, right? So it's basically a very powerful statement saying that the people will design society around the risks and the reality that they experience. So, and I'll close with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salah. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Are there any questions at this point? Whether from the audience or Dr. Edwards or Maddie?
Y'all can just call me Paul. You don't have to say Dr. Edwards. But, yeah, I have a question or a comment. I'm not sure which. That was really interesting, Salah. Thank you. It makes me think, of course, of climate-related disasters and insurance, which is a increasingly complicated issue in places where climate change is starting to have really serious effects, such as Florida in the United States and lots of other places in the world too. But I've always thought that when the insurance industry really wakes up to the risk, the future risk of climate change, that's going to be a moment where lots of things will happen. There could be a real estate crisis, other kinds of financial impacts. So I'm curious about, what you've seen in the things that you've looked at where insurance played a role, if any.
I think that's an excellent question. I noted it down because I really need to. I think it is not on my radar. I know that insurance companies they have a slightly different approach to risk as well. But it's I mean, obviously in the end it's an economic focus. But I don't think I don't want to commit to an answer that I don't because I really want to focus on adding insurance, the practice of insurance companies as well. But at this point, I haven't really researched that, so there's nothing that I think I can add to that.
Well, I think you could think about it as it's a private sector version of government taking responsibility after a crisis, and and it is effectively a way of depoliticizing risk because it doesn't rely on the government until the disaster is so big that it can't that the insurance companies fail and they can't do it. And that's has happened in financial crises as well as in physical ones.
Yeah, I mean they have a very important role. As you also mentioned, I mean, also in the creation of regulations and creation of pushing back. Actually, it's a really good point. I have to go look deeper into that because I really want to come back and answer that question. There's a lot going on in insurance companies. It's just that they are very much involved in also creating this new reality. Yeah.
I think we've just got like a couple of minutes to wrap up the session. So thank you for the question, Paul. And thank you for the presentation, Salah. It was wonderful, great perspectives. And so to sort of wrap it up, right? I had a closing.
There's one more question.
We don't have the time for that. So I just wanted to thank.
Emma, we've got a question in the room.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
of course, yeah.
Yeah, or yeah.
So great talk. And one thing I notice is the through line for everyone is the idea of time and how it's been, how people are impacted by the time scales for each of the different issues. And I noticed with Salah, yours is finance, where I think time doesn't necessarily, it has an ebb and flow when it comes to financial wealth and everything that can be done, like a lifetime of wealth can be made in like a year or 2 years versus other types of timelines. Dr. Edwards, you were talking about, looking at climate change in the big part. So I come from space where I'm never going to see the end of any of the work that I do just because of the time scale. So how do you instill short and long-term thinking into the work? And how would you really want to perpetuate the mission of whether it's money or climate change, or in your case, looking at different public works, how do you instill that so that it perpetuates beyond what we see now in our lifetimes? That's a great question.
I don't actually think that's being picked up on the mic in Zoom.
Oh,
No, we got it. We got it. We heard it.
yeah.
Okay, perfect. Great. I
Yeah.
also put it in the Q&A just in case.
Thank you.
But if this
Thank you.
mic is working, I will say that's a great question. Right now, I'm thinking about short-term scales, because I'm sort of stuck in that permitting timeline in some ways. For me, I think I see those perpetuating forward in changing norms. And if we can establish new best practices, then I think those can outlive the one-off projects I'm looking at.
Let me add to that. So for me, there are two things. So the intergenerational, the way that people still use their history to negotiate with the future, right? So the practice your practice, the education, etc. How you use that in society, that is an element of time, because there's a baggage. You go into the future. Then there's the other that provoked in terms of time was the idea of the emergency imaginary, the idea that we don't really connect the event itself with the emergency, right? So there could be an emergency before the actual event happens. That's the kind of work that I'm also focused on here. Is like, how do you bring the event itself much more to the foreground instead of responding to it afterwards, right? So, and it's for the human imagination, it's not always clear of when do we respond and when the emergency should be an emergency and when not. So that's the other time element.
It's such a good question that I find it really hard to respond. In a lot of ways, I feel like the whole world is reaching for that right now around climate change. Lots of different imaginaries of how things might be. You have eco-modernism, you have degrowth and green growth, and the physical hazards of climate change being projected into the future. But how do those connect with the vulnerabilities and the exposures of people on the ground? It's just that's a life work kind of question. I wish you luck answering it for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Thank you for that, and thank you for the questions as well. So it was a great session. Thank you, Forrest, and thank you all for coming and participating in this panel. It was a great discussion. I'm actually quite thrilled that we organized this, and we've come to an end, and sort of hope to keep this conversation going beyond this panel as well, and beyond this conference as well. So I'm going to be sort of writing up sort of a post-conference blog on the panel proceedings and post it on our website. And I'm happy to share it with all of you, and also probably with the organizers. And of course the video is recorded, and we'll have access to it as well, and probably up on YouTube as well. Hope to have this collaboration going and discuss this in the future as well. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
And everyone else. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Excellent.